It was the kind of day that a father counts down to for years. A sunlit Saturday morning, the smell of cut grass hanging in the air, and rows of folding chairs lined up in perfect symmetry on the football field. At the center of it all stood a stage draped in school colors, waiting for the slow march of graduates who had endured 12 years of books, tests, victories, and heartbreak. At the edge of the crowd, a man adjusted his jacket and scanned the field. His name was Master Sergeant Elijah Brooks, a retired U.S. Marine with 22 years of service, 3 deployments overseas, and more medals than he ever cared to count. Today, however, none of those mattered. He wasn't here as a Marine. He was here as a father. Elijah had taken his seat early, wearing his sharp Navy blazer and the Marine Corps lapel pin that quietly announced who he was. In his hands, he held a small camcorder, ready to capture every second of his son Marcus's walk across that stage. But as the band began to warm up and families settled into quiet anticipation, 2 uniformed security guards approached from the side. Their movements were deliberate, their expressions unreadable. One of them leaned down slightly and spoke in a low but firm tone. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave." For a moment, Elijah thought he'd misheard. He blinked. "Leave? Why?" The second guard shifted, avoiding eye contact. "We've had a report. Some parents feel uncomfortable. You match the description of someone who doesn't belong here." Elijah stared at them. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, not anger yet, but the stunned disbelief that comes when reality suddenly twists in a direction you didn't see coming. He glanced around. Families laughed and chatted, some looking toward him now with curious glances. "I'm here for my son's graduation," Elijah said, keeping his voice steady. "His name is Marcus Brooks. He's the valedictorian. I have an invitation." He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out the crisp white card with the school emblem. The first guard looked at it briefly, then shook his head. "We're still going to have to ask you to step outside. We can sort this out there." In the pit of his stomach, Elijah felt a familiar weight. It was the same weight he'd carried during certain moments in his career, moments when his skin seemed to enter the room before he did, when his uniform wasn't enough to erase assumptions. He thought of Marcus, lined up with his classmates, not knowing that his father was being escorted out before he could see him take the stage. This was the day they had talked about since elementary school. This was supposed to be his moment, too. "Sir," the first guard said more firmly now, "we don't want to make this a scene." But a scene was already forming. A few rows ahead, a tall man in a dark suit had turned around. His sharp eyes narrowed as he took in the situation. Then, another man stood, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, moving with the calm precision of someone who had spent his life in uniform. And then another. In less than a minute, 6 men began to walk toward Elijah. Their movements were purposeful but unhurried, cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a tide parting the shore. When they reached him, the first one, a man with a silver trident pin on his lapel, spoke. "Is there a problem here?" His voice carried not just across the small circle, but far enough that nearby families began to lean in. One of the guards cleared his throat. "This gentleman needs to step outside. He's causing discomfort to other attendees." The man with the trident smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried steel beneath it. "You mean Master Sergeant Brooks? 22 years of service in the United States Marine Corps? Bronze Star recipient? The man who trained half the Marines I served with overseas?" The air seemed to tighten. Elijah hadn't recognized the men at first, but now he saw it. The way they stood, balanced yet ready. The quiet authority in their eyes. Navy SEALs, not in uniform, but unmistakable. The silver trident man continued, his tone calm but unyielding. "He's not leaving. Not unless you want to explain to every person here why the father of the valedictorian can't watch his own son graduate. By now, the murmurs had grown louder. People were watching openly, phones beginning to rise, lenses pointed toward the standoff. The first guard shifted uncomfortably. "We're just following protocol." "What protocol is that?" Another SEAL interrupted. His voice was deep, his gaze locked on the guard. "The one where you single out a black veteran for standing quietly. At his son's graduation?" The words hung in the air. No one moved. Somewhere near the stage, the band faltered, as if the musicians too had sensed the shift. Elijah stood silently, torn between gratitude and discomfort at the attention. But the SEALs formed a loose semicircle around him now, an unspoken message radiating from their stance. "You will not move this man." One of them leaned toward Elijah, speaking just loud enough for him to hear. "We served with men like you, Master Sergeant. We've got your 6. The guards glanced at each other, their earlier certainty melting into unease. Finally, the first one muttered something about checking with the principal and walked away, his partner following. The SEALs didn't move until the guards were out of sight. Then the silver trident man turned to Elijah with a small nod. "Enjoy the ceremony, sir." Elijah's throat tightened. He wasn't a man who cried easily, but the sudden rush of loyalty and solidarity hit harder than he expected. "Thank you," he said quietly. As they moved back to their seats, the crowd slowly returned to its pre-ceremony hum. But the story of what had just happened would ripple through those rows for the rest of the day and far beyond. When the graduates finally began their march, Elijah's camera was steady in his hands, and when Marcus crossed the stage to deliver his speech, his father's pride was visible from the back row to the furthest corner of the field. Little did they know, the real speech, the one people would talk about for years, hadn't been spoken from the stage at all. It had been made in silence. 6 men standing in quiet defiance, reminding everyone that dignity isn't given. It's defended. When Marcus took the podium, he scanned the sea of faces until he found his father. The relief on Elijah's face was subtle, a slight upward tilt of his chin, a glimmer in his eyes. But Marcus caught it. What he didn't know, at least not yet, was how close that moment had come to being stolen. His speech began with practiced composure, but midway through he paused, looking down at the note cards in his hand. "I had something written for today," he said slowly, "but I think I need to say something else." A ripple of curiosity moved through the audience. "My father taught me a lot about perseverance," Marcus continued. "Not just on the basketball court or in academics, but in life. He taught me that you don't walk away from a place where you belong, and you don't let anyone else decide your worth. And I'm here today at this podium because he lived that lesson before I was even born." The words hung in the still air, heavier now. A few rows from the front, one of the SEALs shifted, folding his arms across his chest. "My dad served his country for more than 2 decades, Marcus went on. "But more than that, he served his family every day since. And when I walk off this stage, I'll be walking straight to him, because that's who I want to be like." The applause began slowly, but it built into something more than polite acknowledgement. It was a rolling, insistent wave of clapping, the kind that carries a meaning beneath the sound. Elijah sat still for a moment, his jaw tight, before lifting his hand slightly in a gesture of gratitude. After the ceremony, the field became a whirl of hugs, photographs, and congratulations. Marcus pushed through the crowd until he reached his father, throwing his arms around him in a way he hadn't done in years. Elijah held on a little longer than usual. "Proud of you, son," he said quietly. "I heard something happened," Marcus replied, his voice low but firm. "One of my friends told me you almost weren't here. Is that true?" Elijah hesitated. "Doesn't matter now. I'm here. That's what counts." Marcus pulled back, studying his father's face. "It matters to me, because I don't want to live in a world where that's normal, and I don't want anyone else's dad missing something like this because someone decided they didn't belong." The conversation might have ended there, but one of the SEALs approached, the same man with the silver trident pin. "Mind if I get a photo with you two?" he asked, smiling. "Gonna send it to a few buddies." Marcus grinned. "Sure." The three of them stood shoulder to shoulder, the sun warm on their backs, and for a moment it was just a picture. But to everyone who would see it later, it would be a symbol. Over the next few days, the story took on a life of its own. It began with a handful of parents who had witnessed the scene and posted about it online. Then a local reporter called, followed by another from a regional station. Soon, Elijah's phone was buzzing with unfamiliar numbers and messages from people he hadn't heard from in years. The narrative was straightforward but powerful. A decorated Marine nearly removed from his son's graduation, defended by 6 Navy SEALs who refused to let it happen. It wasn't sensationalized. It didn't need to be. Some called it a story about brotherhood in the armed forces. Others called it a lesson in courage. But for Elijah, it was more complicated. He'd spent his career in places where the stakes were life or death, where decisions had to be made in seconds, and yet somehow the quiet humiliation of that morning had been harder to shake than most of those memories. One evening, a week after the graduation, Elijah sat with Marcus on the back porch. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the lawn. "Son," Elijah began, "I don't want you to think what happened defines us. It's part of the world, but it's not the whole world. There are people, like those SEALs, who'll stand up when it matters, and you have to decide, every day, which kind of person you'll be." Marcus nodded slowly. "I think I already know." There was silence for a while, broken only by the sound of crickets beginning their evening chorus. Elijah thought about the SEALs, men he hadn't known personally, but who had recognized something in him worth protecting. They hadn't done it for thanks or recognition. They'd done it because, in their eyes, leaving him behind wasn't an option. That, he realized, was the truest form of service. Months later, Marcus left for college, carrying with him not just his father's lessons, but the unspoken promise that he would carry them forward. And Elijah, though he still wore the weight of that day, began speaking at local schools and community centers, telling the story, not for sympathy but for understanding. He told it the way a Marine tells a mission report, clear, detailed, and without exaggeration. He spoke about dignity, about the quiet power of standing firm, and about the unexpected allies who sometimes step forward when the moment demands it. And every time he reached the part about the 6 SEALs, his voice would slow, not for drama, but because even now it still moved him. They didn't make speeches, he would say. They didn't shout. They just stood there. And in that silence, they said everything that needed to be said. The impact of that day didn't fade. For some, it was a reminder that discrimination still wore many faces, sometimes obvious, sometimes disguised as procedure. For others, it was a story of hope, proof that solidarity could cut through division. For Elijah, it was both. It was a wound and a reminder, a moment of pain made bearable by an act of quiet courage. And though the years would carry him further, from that football field, the memory would stay, not as a moment when he was almost removed, but as the day when 6 men made sure he stayed. In the end, the graduation was remembered for more than its speeches or its diplomas. It was remembered as the day dignity was defended without a single raised voice, the day strangers became brothers, and the day a young man saw in real time what honor looked like. And somewhere in a box in Elijah's living room, next to the Marine medals and folded flags, sat a framed photograph. Marcus in his cap and gown, Elijah at his side, and 6 SEALs standing quietly behind them. A picture that said everything words never could.